You wake up feeling heavy. Not physically tired necessarily, but carrying something invisible, something unnamed. You reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor. You scroll through noise before you have spoken a single word to yourself. And somewhere beneath that impulse, there is a question you refuse to ask. Who am I becoming when no one is watching? Carl Jung understood that the morning is not neutral. It is the battlefield where your conscious will either takes command or surrenders to the patterns running beneath your awareness. Mental strength is not built in moments of crisis. It is built in the first quiet minutes of the day. Before the world makes its demands, before you perform for others, before the persona takes over. Most people believe mental strength is about endurance, about pushing through, about gritting your teeth until something breaks or bends. But Jung saw it differently. He saw that real psychological power comes from integration, not force. It comes from meeting yourself fully in the space between sleep and action, between unconsciousness and the roles you must play. The morning is where the shadow waits. It is where your unacknowledged impulses, your avoided responsibilities, or hidden resentments rise to the surface if you allow them. And most people do not allow them. They fill that space immediately with distraction, with external input, with anything that keeps them from facing what is actually there. You have been taught that strength is loud, that it announces itself, that it requires motivation, inspiration, some external spark to ignite the will. But Jung knew that true strength is silent. It does not need an audience. It does not need permission. It begins in the dark, in the stillness, in the moment when you choose to turn inward instead of outward. The morning ritual is not about productivity. It is not about optimization or performance. It is about reclaiming authority over your own psyche before the world colonizes your attention. When you wake and immediately reach for something outside yourself, you are enacting a form of psychological surrender. You are saying that your internal state is insufficient, that you need external validation or stimulation to feel real. This is not a moral failing. It is a defense mechanism. Jung called it identification with the persona, the mask you wear to navigate social reality. But the persona is not you. It is a necessary tool, a bridge between your inner world and the outer one. When you begin your day by feeding the persona before acknowledging the self, you invert the natural order of psychological development. You become hollow. You become reactive. You become dependent on conditions outside your control to determine your internal stability. Mental strength in the morning is the practice of meeting yourself before you meet the world. It is the discipline of sitting with discomfort, with boredom, with the absence of stimulation, and discovering that you do not dissolve. You do not need constant input to exist. You do not need to be entertained or distracted or soothed by external forces. This realization is threatening to the ego because the ego survives by identifying with its roles, its achievements, its image. But beneath the ego, there is something older, something more fundamental. Jung called it the self. And the self does not need your performance. It only needs your presence. The shadow emerges most clearly in the morning because that is when your defenses are lowest. You have not yet constructed the day's narrative. You have not yet decided who you will pretend to be. And in that vulnerable space, the parts of yourself you have been avoiding begin to speak. The anger you sublimate into politeness. The fear you disguise as busyness. The shame you cover with achievement. These are not enemies. They are messengers. And if you silence them immediately, if you drown them in distraction, they do not disappear. They go underground. They become compulsions, projections, unconscious patterns that control you precisely because you refuse to acknowledge them, Building mental strength every morning means creating a space where the unconscious can surface without being judged or suppressed. This does not require elaborate rituals or spiritual practices. It requires stillness. It requires the willingness to sit with yourself, to breathe, to notice what is present without immediately trying to fix it or escape it. Most people cannot do this for even 5 minutes. Not because they lack discipline, but because they have never been taught that their own company is bearable. They have been conditioned to believe that silence is emptiness, that solitude is loneliness, that the absence of external stimulation is a problem to be solved. But Jung understood that the unconscious is not a problem. It is a resource. It contains everything you have disowned, everything you have repressed, everything you have judged as unacceptable. And until you retrieve those fragments, until you integrate them back into consciousness, you remain fragmented. You remain at war with yourself. You remain dependent on the world to tell you who you are. The morning is when you can begin to change this. Not through force, but through presence. Not through discipline as punishment, but through discipline as devotion to your own wholeness. When you begin your day by grounding yourself in silence, something shifts in how you move through the world. You become less reactive. You become less dependent on external validation. You become less vulnerable to manipulation because you are no longer seeking approval from others to fill the void where your self-relationship should be. This is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about becoming anchored. It is about having an internal reference point that does not collapse when circumstances change. Other people will react to this. They will sense that you are not performing in the same way. They will feel unsettled by your calmness, by your lack of urgency to prove yourself. This is projection. When someone is unconscious of their own fragmentation, they experience your integration as a threat. They interpret your silence as judgment. They interpret your self-sufficiency as arrogance. This is not your responsibility to manage. Jung taught that we cannot individuate for others. We can only do our own work and allow that work to speak for itself. The persona wants you to believe that strength is about control, about dominating your environment, about never showing weakness. But this is a trap. True psychological strength is the capacity to hold paradox, to be disciplined without being rigid, to be open without being passive, to be confident without being defensive. The morning practice is where you learn to hold these tensions. You learn that you can be vulnerable and strong. You can be uncertain and steady. You can be flawed and whole. Projection is the shadow's favorite disguise. When you refuse to acknowledge your own weaknesses, you begin to see them everywhere in others. You become critical, judgmental, reactive. You lose the ability to see people as they are because you are too busy defending against what they represent in your own psyche. The morning is when you can interrupt this pattern. You can ask yourself, what am I avoiding in myself that I am projecting onto the world? What am I blaming others for that is actually my responsibility to integrate? This is not comfortable work. It is not motivational. It does not produce instant results or measurable outcomes. But it is the only work that matters if you want to live from a place of inner authority instead of external dependency. Jung believed that most people live their entire lives without ever asking who they actually are beneath the roles they play. They die strangers to themselves. They spend decades performing, achieving, adapting, never once turn inward to see what all that activity is defending against. Mental strength is not built by avoiding pain. It is built by meeting it consciously, by choosing to feel what you have been running from, by allowing the unconscious material to surface so that it can be seen, understood, and integrated. This is the descent Jung spoke of. It is not dramatic. It is not mystical. It is simply the act of turning toward yourself with honesty instead of turning away with distraction. The morning is the practice ground. It is where you learn to be with yourself without needing to be different, without needing to be better, without needing to be fixed. You learn that your worth is not conditional, that your presence is enough, that the voice inside you is wiser than the noise outside you. And slowly, over time, this changes everything. You stop seeking validation because you are no longer validating yourself through external achievement. You stop fearing judgment because you are no longer judging yourself through the eyes of others. You stop performing because you are no longer trying to convince anyone, including yourself, that you are acceptable. You simply are. And from that place of being, you act. Not from compulsion, not from fear, not from the need to prove, but from alignment with something deeper. This is what Jung meant by individuation. It is the process of becoming who you actually are, instead of who you were conditioned to be. And it begins in the morning. It begins in the choice to meet yourself first, to sit in silence, to breathe, to notice, to allow, to integrate every single day. Not because it feels good, but because it is real. The world will offer you endless distractions, endless reasons to avoid this work, endless ways to stay busy, to stay numb, to stay fragmented. And you will be tempted. You will be tempted to believe that checking your phone is harmless, that scrolling is just relaxation, that you do not have time for stillness. But these are lies the ego tells to protect itself from change. The ego knows that if you turn inward, if you start integrating the shadow, if you start building real psychological strength, it will lose its grip. It will no longer be able to control you through fear, through shame, through the endless need for external approval. And that is terrifying for the ego. But it is liberation for the self. The self does not need to defend. It does not need to justify. It does not need to perform. It simply is. And when you align with it, when you build your morning practice around reconnecting with it, you become unshakable. Not because you are invincible, but because you are grounded. Not because you have no fear, but because you are no longer ruled by it. Silence in the morning is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is the space where you remember that you are more than your thoughts, more than your emotions, more than your circumstances. You are the awareness that witnesses all of it. And that awareness does not need to be fixed. It does not need to be improved. It only needs to be acknowledged. This is the foundation of mental strength. Not the strength to endure suffering, but the strength to be present with it. Not the strength to control outcomes, but the strength to stay anchored regardless of outcomes. Not the strength to dominate others, but the strength to stop abandoning yourself. Every morning, you have a choice. You can begin your day by giving your attention away, by letting the world tell you what to think, what to feel, what to value. Or you can begin by reclaiming that attention, by turning it inward, by asking yourself what is true before the world starts telling you what is important. This is not selfish. It is essential. You cannot show up for others if you have not first shown up for yourself. You cannot offer presence if you have not cultivated it within. Jung saw that most suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from internal fragmentation, from the war between who you are and who you think you should be, from the exhaustion of maintaining a persona that does not fit, from the shame of carrying a shadow you refuse to acknowledge. The morning practice is where you begin to heal that fragmentation, where you begin to bring the unconscious into the light, where you begin to integrate what you have been disowning. And as you do this work, as you build this discipline, you will notice that the world around you begins to change. Not because the world has changed, but because you are no longer projecting your unresolved material onto it. You are no longer reacting from a place of unconsciousness. You are responding from a place of awareness. And that changes everything. You become someone who can hold space for complexity, who can tolerate ambiguity, who can sit with discomfort without needing to numb it or fix it or blame it on someone else. You become someone who knows that strength is not about never falling apart, but about having the capacity to come back together. Again and again and again. This is the work. This is the practice. This is what it means to build mental strength every morning. Not through force, but through presence. Not through avoidance, but through integration. Not through performance, but through authenticity. And it starts with one simple choice: to meet yourself fully and honestly before you meet the world.